Welcome back, everybody. We are going to do the other part of Chapter 1, which is just covering the juvenile justice system. So we've discussed that prior to the juvenile justice system, everybody was treated the same by the same set of laws, the same incarceration of all ages. And obviously we began to, question that practice and move away from it. So one thing that you need to know is that the juvenile justice system has its own set of what I call players, right? It has its own set of judges. It has its own set of prosecutors. It has its own set of juvenile probation officers that are all specific to the juvenile justice system. They don't, travel back and forth from the adult system to the juvenile justice system. If you work in the juvenile justice system, you don't work with adults, you just work with juveniles. So there is a whole different set of people that work in that system above and beyond, above and beyond the adult system. Okay, so the juvenile justice system we've talked about functions differently than the adult system. And one of the things that's different about it is the language. There's a whole different set of language that we use in the juvenile justice system, largely to avoid stigmatizing the people who come into it. We don't want to put a label on an adolescent who made a mistake and then have that label follow that adolescent into adulthood, where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we use different terminology. And we're going to start with delinquency. And delinquency is any behavior prohibited by law, right? We don't call it criminality because then people, it'll end up with people being called criminals, right? We don't want to call a young 12-year-old who made a bad decision about graffiti a criminal, have that label follow him or her, and suddenly they begin to live up to the label. Right? So we say delinquency. We say adjudicated in an instance when a juvenile is found guilty of breaking the law. We do not say convicted because, again, we don't want people calling them convicts. Right? They are adjudicated. It means they are found guilty of breaking the law. We call these children delinquents. We don't call them criminals. I know that comes with a strong negative connotation of its own. I don't know if we'll ever revise this language. I wouldn't say that that's sort of I would say delinquent has a lot of, baggage that comes with it, but we don't call them criminals. There's also something called a status offender or status offenses, which is a different category of offending. Status offenses are any act of delinquency that is considered against the law only because you are under the age of the majority. You are still considered a legal child. You are under the age of 18. Were you over the age of 18, what you're doing would not be considered a crime. So, for example, drinking underage, smoking, vaping. At some point, all of these things you're going to be legally old enough to do, and it is therefore not a crime. So we punish status offenses a little bit differently because it's not a violent crime. It's not a serious crime. In fact, in the near future, it's going to become legal for you to do. Truancy, breaking curfews. These are all examples of status offenses. I want you to know that the jurisdiction of juvenile court is different. We handle all juvenile court matters in the civil court. We do not handle it in the criminal court. Again, it comes back to that stigmatization. We don't want to even associate our juveniles who are adjudicated or who are delinquent. We don't even want to associate them with the adult criminal court. So we handle all of it in the civil court, specifically in the family court. And the family court covers a lot of things. It covers the juvenile justice court. It also covers issues of, parental rights and parental custody and things of that nature. But the big distinction here is that it is handled in a civil court, not a criminal court. Jumping back to our status offenders, there's different language, and it's going to vary from state to state. They all mean the same thing. You'll hear me refer to them. They can all be used interchangeably. So this is how we refer to certain status offenders. We call them chins, pins, mins, and gins. And what that means is chin, child in need of services; pin, person in need of services; gin, juvenile in need of services; mins, minor in need of services. They all mean the same thing. They're all referencing status offenders. It just depends on what state we're talking about. We'll use different verbiage. The next issue I want to talk about is incorrigibility. So, if you're an adult, there's no such thing as incorrigibility. You're just difficult, right, and unpleasant. But incorrigibility is a state of being for a child, and it is a state of being that can result of referral to the juvenile justice system. And incorrigibility is when a child is defiant and difficult and they will not follow the rules, and they, mom and dad can't get control over them. A child, an adolescent, can be deemed incorrigible and referred to the juvenile justice system, where that child will be removed from the household and they will enter foster care or some other approach. So I want you to know that language. But the idea here, again, is, we're really looking to avoid stigmatizing. So we have a whole different set of language. But this is all language that you need to understand prior to us getting into the course in order for you to understand overall concepts. Okay, so in addition to the issue of jurisdiction of what the juvenile court covers. The juvenile court also has jurisdiction over other issues such as child abuse, child neglect, child sexual abuse, etc. Those are the areas we're going to be getting into it to some extent. Again, like I said, we're not really going to get into custody issues or anything of that capacity. But it begs the question, what is a juvenile? How do we define a juvenile? Right? And the legal answer is anybody under the age of the majority, which is 18 years old, right? So anybody under the age of 18 years old is a juvenile. You are considered a legal child. However, is this an arbitrary line is the question that always comes up. Do you go from, one day you're 17 and the next day you're 18 and now you're an adult? No, not in my experience personally, not in my experience of what I've seen, from other kids growing up. And this is where it becomes this question of arbitrary lines. Like, why is that the line, right? If there's not much difference between a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old, not that much difference between a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, right? So why is that the line? The line of legal culpability. There's a lot of people who argue that that line is in the wrong place. That there are decades of research that now support that the human brain isn't done growing until the age of 25, and therefore people make the argument, why are we holding them fully accountable for behaviors and decisions that they made before their brain was finished growing? Why is the age of majority not older? Is it fair for us to hold them accountable if their cognitive development isn't complete? That's an argument for another day, but that's sort of something I want you to think about, right? That idea that, like, do we magically become adults the day we turn 18? Certainly not in my experience. There's also something we call a minimum age of jurisdiction. Every state has a minimum age of jurisdiction, and it's different. It's up to the states to decide what that age is. And what that is there is a lower level of age where if you are at this age or below, you cannot be brought into the juvenile justice system, regardless of the behaviors. So let me give you an example. There are documented cases. Thankfully, it's not overly common, but it has happened more than once, where, let's use the example of a 4-year-old whose, mom and dad are going to be having a baby, and the baby comes, and the 4-year-old's feeling jealous, and the 4-year-old's feeling like they're left behind or forgotten, and they get very angry with the baby, and so they take the baby and they throw it out a second-story window, right? Certainly a horrendous tragedy for all involved. Do we arrest that 4-year-old and take that 4-year-old to juvenile court? Of course we don't. Right? A 4-year-old doesn't have the cognitive capacity to understand the long-term effects of death, right? Or to understand the harm caused by throwing a child out the window. A 4-year-old has the cognitive capacity to understand that if I get rid of this child, then the attention will come back to me, right? That's what they understand. This is why we have a minimum age of jurisdiction, because there's certain age underneath which kids are simply cognitively too young and underdeveloped to have motive, to, they're not demons, they're not evil, they just literally don't understand the long-term consequences of their actions yet. And unfortunately, tragedies sometimes do happen. But we don't take them to juvenile court. We don't remove them from parental custody. Certainly, we hope they get into treatment, therapy, etc., but we don't involve them in the formal system. Now, to give you an idea, here in Pennsylvania, our minimum age of jurisdiction is 10 years old. So anything under the age of 10, you're not going to be brought into the juvenile court. North Carolina goes as young as 6, and 6 is really young, right? I cannot imagine a 6-year-old going before a judge and being able to comprehend even what's going on. But like we said, each state gets to make those decisions. New York, the age is 7. Arizona, the age is 8. California, the age is 12. So it's completely up to the states to decide that minimum age of jurisdiction, and it's going to vary. Okay. Want you to understand that juveniles can enter the juvenile justice system by referral in a number of ways. Okay. So when an adult is referred to the criminal justice system, it's usually by the police, right? Somebody called the police showed up, the process begins, or the police just were, doing their job and saw somebody do something, they arrest the person, and there the person goes. It's different with juveniles. With juveniles, certainly, the police refer lots of juveniles. Arresting officers refer a lot of juveniles. But that's not where it stops. Parents can refer them. Schools can refer them. Victims can refer them. Probation officers, if a juvenile probation officer has a juvenile on their caseload and the juvenile engages in a crime, they will refer them. So there's a lot more points of entry for juveniles than there are for adults into their formal system. Not all arrested minors are going to enter into the juvenile justice system. As with adults, police have a ton of discretionary decision making, and based on the situation that they come upon, it's usually a situation where, like, well, I can't just send you home because this isn't okay, but I don't think you should be up for formal probation or up for secure detention. So they do what is called diversionary practices. They divert the child away from the system. So they take them into custody and they say, okay, you're not going to go before the court, but you do have to go to community service, or you have to engage in restorative justice and pay for the damage that you caused, or fix the damage that you caused. If you put graffiti all over the side of this person's house, then guess what? You're going to go repaint that house, right? So they engage in diversionary programs to keep these kids out of formal processing, but to at the same time still hold them accountable and still teach them and guide them away from the bad behavior. There are 3 steps to the juvenile court. The first is intake. And intake happens after arrest. A juvenile probation officer or a prosecuting officer, prosecutor, will determine whether to dismiss the case and send the juvenile home to their parents, the custody of their parents, or to handle the issue informally, send them into a diversionary program, or to send them to the juvenile court. Next is going to be if there is an informal hearing, it's going to be the same as, police going diversionary tactics. It's going to be like paying restitution, going into drug therapy, drug or alcohol counseling, going into therapy, things of that nature to fix the problem that's causing the misbehavior. The prosecutor can pursue the case in juvenile court, or they can waive the case into the adult court. And we're going to talk a lot about waiver in much more detail as the term goes on. But you need to know what waiver is and understand it. So waiver is when the juvenile court will look at the arrest of a child, and this only happens in cases of noteworthy violence. They'll look at the case and say, look, if we handle this in the juvenile court and the child is adjudicated guilty, this is a 15-year-old kid, the most they can be is in a secure facility for 3 years. In some states, they can be in a secure facility up to 21. That's going to be a state-by-state difference. Okay. That's not an adequate punishment for a child who murders somebody. So we're going to waive them into the adult system and let the adult criminal court try them. And they will be tried as an adult, regardless of the fact that they are not. That's waiving. That's waiver. Waving them over and saying, we're not going to make a call about guilt or innocence. The criminal court, the adult court can do that. But if you are guilty, if you are found guilty, you need the consequence of the adult court. We don't have the ability to provide the proper outcome. And that's what's called waiver. We talked about adjudication, which is the determination of a guilty act. Juveniles who are adjudicated will then go through the process of disposition, and that's where they're going to determine the outcome. What is the outcome of your adjudication? Do you go to probation, or do you go to a secure facility, a residential placement? If a child is remanded to residential placement, there are lots of different options. So they can go to an institution, they can go to a camp or a ranch, they can go to a group home. And that residential facility that outcome, it can be for a specific period of time, or it can be what we call indeterminate. meaning we're not going to give you a final end date when you get to go home. What we're going to do is we're going to reevaluate periodically over a period of time, and we're going to talk to the people who work at your secure facility and say, how's the behavior? Do we have infractions? Do we have problems? Do we have model behavior? Do we have good behavior? And depending on how you respond to the residential facility will determine how long your stay in the residential facility is and when you get to go home.